views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hi guys, I'm M, also known as the Hungry Dominican, and I'm your host for Foodie Down Bronx. This is the show where we catch up with artists, entrepreneurs, chefs, and foodies who make up part of the incredible and ever-growing Bronx food scene. So if you like to eat, get your appetites ready and stay tuned. From BronxNet to the world, this is Foodie Down Bronx. Welcome to Foodie Down Bronx. Stay connected to us on Instagram at BronxNet TV and Foodie Down Bronx, and make sure to follow me at the Hungry Dominican. On today's show, we'll sit with the producers behind Racist Sandwich, a podcast exploring race, gender, and class in the food industry. And we'll also broach a few other topics such as personal motivations, goals, and of course, social media. But before we meet our guest, let's get into this week's Chew News. La Morada restaurant is a family-owned Oaxacan restaurant in the South Bronx with a goal to preserve and share indigenous Mexican cuisine. The Saavedra family has been transparent about being an undocumented family and have made their business a safe space for the immigrant community through culture, arts, and initiatives while actively participating in social justice causes. Marco Saavedra of La Morada has been fighting to get asylum in the U.S. He recently had an asylum hearing, press conference, and a march at Federal Plaza. We were there to capture it. Let's check it out.
Marco Saavedra, an immigrant rights activist, recently had an asylum hearing at 26 Federal Plaza. As a prominent advocate for human rights, Saavedra is requesting asylum because he fears that he will face persecution if he's forced to return to Mexico.
In the last year, 2019, 19 activists have been killed in Mexico, and 10 of them were from my home state of Oaxaca. And we see 103 deaths every day in Mexico because of the drugs on war and the impunity that the cartels enjoy in Mexico. So this continues in my home country.
If Marco is sent back to Mexico, he will be persecuted. He will be tortured and possibly killed because of his political opinions defending immigrant rights in Mexico. It's a dangerous thing in Mexico, and there's no rule of law, and he will have no protection from the state of Mexico.
Marco has been living in the United States for 26 years. He and his family have been transparent about being undocumented and have established themselves as a staple in the South Bronx with their Oaxacan restaurant, La Morada. The restaurant was closed the day of Marco's hearing as the family stood by him surrounded by supporters.
I know this is my home, this is my family, this is my community, and we're here to put up a big fight. Regardless of what happens, we're gonna stay together as a family. So if you want the best mole, to stick around, the best Oaxacan food, the best tacos, according to Thrillist and Michelin, and all that good stuff, yes, served in the South Bronx, then let's make sure to support Marco's.
We are indigenous, and this is our land. We are Americans, and Marco deserves to be here. This is his home. And please tell everyone out there, we need support. And it's also for all these politicians that they knock on those doors when they need volunteers, when they need organizers. We're there. And I don't see anyone here today supporting Marco. I don't see anyone from the city council. I don't see anyone that have been in the Morada eating the delicious food in here. I only see activists and religious leaders.
Marco and supporters marched in solidarity to his hearing at 26 Federal Plaza. The results of his asylum status are yet to be decided. La Morada posted this message to their social media, stating that attorneys must submit final statements. They expect to hear a verdict by January 2020. Marco and family request the continued support of the community and elected officials at this time.
We also have to hold our own elected officials accountable because they can't just cater to the Latino vote every 4 years and then not follow up.
Reporting for BronxNet, Sanji Lopez.
In other news, Everybody Eats Key Ingredients for a Successful Small Business was a conversation hosted by the creative collective and NYC Food Muse, Rosanna Anil. Rosanna, of course, was a guest here on Foodie Down Bronx several episodes ago and was my co-host for the Foodie Down Bronx panel. At this event, 5 female food entrepreneurs shared what it takes to launch and maintain a small business. Participants were able to ask questions and seek advice from the panelists. Let's check out this clip.
I think a lot of times people think of a restaurant and they primarily think of spending money on like just like developing the menu and finding your suppliers and all that stuff. But while we were still figuring all that stuff out, at least initially, just having a beautiful space is like amazing marketing on a street level. People walking in like, hey, what is that? Oh, that place looks so cute. It should be in Soho. And I'm like, nah, man, it's here. It's in Brooklyn.
Creating the name is important because that's an initial incentive for anyone to go into your Instagram, right? So for us, Next Stop Vegan was created from the idea of, being a Bronx native and taking the train, and it's like every stop is like the next stop towards veganism. So it's like next stop, Gordon Road, next stop. So the concept behind my name has created a story that has allowed my brand to grow on its own.
Honestly, what I did to learn the coffee business is I went to coffee shops. I sat down at Starbucks and I was watching how they work. I would go and ask questions like, what machine is this? What does this do? I would go to cafes. So I would say go and mimic and see the business that you want to get into. If you have to go and get a job at Starbucks, get a job just in your prospective field.
Special shout out goes to Rosanna for once again being an incredible host and putting together an amazing panel of women who doled out some really informative advice for anyone looking to get into the food industry. And a very special thank you to Chef Lioness, who was gracious enough to give the audience in attendance some incredible empanadas. Look for Rosanna on Instagram at NYC Food Muse and Chef Lioness at Lioness Cuisine. Shifting gears now, quite literally, Cranksgiving is a food drive on two wheels held in New York City since 1999 with over 80 locations around the globe. Here in the Bronx, Cranksgiving kicked off with the help of Bronx-based organizations and businesses to benefit Bronx residents. The cyclists went on a scavenger hunt and biked through parts of the Bronx, purchasing canned goods and produce to donate to those in need this season. The cyclists returned to the Point CDC, where they gathered all of their donations. Afterwards, participants celebrated at Millie's Corner Restaurant and Bar. Local Bronx brands and restaurants contributed prizes for the participants to enjoy, such as Bronx brand merch, Taste of the Bronx boxes, and Seis Vecinos dinners. All items collected at Bronx Cranksgiving will be donated to Sienna House, a small women's-only shelter in the Highbridge section of the Bronx. And before we wrap things up, I want to thank Tim Vetter of the Voyages of Tim Vetter, a great podcast that's available anywhere podcasts are found. Tim reached out to me and asked me to be on his show and talk a little bit about the food in the Bronx, myself, and of course, this show that you're watching right now. We had a great conversation, and Tim was a great and gracious host. So make sure to check out the latest episode of the Voyages of Tim Vetter. Thank you, Tim. All right, guys, that is this week's Chew News, giving you a little food for thought. Foodie Down Bronx, we'll be right back.
I think what makes Havana Cafe special or different is just our overall environment. It's not just a restaurant.
80% of our guests are return customers, which is wonderful for us. Become a neighborhood gem. This is a restaurant that serves predominantly Cuban dishes.
We have a really well-rounded menu. We have vegetarian, we have vegan options. We also have great sandwiches. Regardless of what you're looking for, we have traditional Latin food, we have traditional Cuban food, but we also have lighter fare. We have a very well-rounded menu, and there's something for everybody.
So we have mojitos. Our bartenders are first class.
Our mojitos are hand muddled, every single one. What people should expect when they come here is that they encounter a family-friendly environment.
I think most of all, what I want people to experience and walk away with is a feeling that they walked in somewhere where they were made to feel like they were at home.
The overall ambiance, the overall feel of family and community and comfort and friendliness that they encounter when they come here, it's genuine. And I think people, they sense that.
To me, Latin cuisine is really an emotion. It has a lot to do obviously with good ingredients, but it's about the passion that you put into the food that you do. And that's what we want people to feel when they come here.
Welcome back to Foodie Down Bronx. I'm your host, M, the Hungry Dominican. Racist Sandwich is a podcast serving up conversations and perspectives you don't hear anywhere else in food media. The podcast explores race, gender, and class in the food industry. It was nominated for a 2019 James Beard Foundation Broadcast Media Award. Let's check out this snippet from episode 58 of Racist Sandwich, Erasing Black Barbecue.
In Texas, barbecue is king. And if you ask just about any Texan these days, they'll tell you that you haven't truly experienced Texas barbecue until you've had the brisket. This is cow country, after all. We do beef. There's Pecan Lodge up in Dallas, Lockhart Smokehouse, the Salt Lick, Cadillac. The list goes on and on. And then we've got the barbecue joint known all around the world. You know, the one that all y'all non-Texans come to Texas for. Franklin's in Austin.
I'm at Franklin Barbecue in Austin, Texas, to find out what it takes to make my favorite barbecue.
Hi, I'm Aaron Franklin from Franklin Barbecue here in Austin, Texas. I'm Aaron Franklin, and we're here at Franklin Barbecue in Austin, Texas.
If there is anyone qualified to write a meat smoking manifesto, it is Aaron Franklin.
But the meat in East and South Texas isn't the stuff making it onto Food Network, Bon Appetit, or BuzzFeed. And that media landscape, filled with trendy, raw, rugged, cool white guys cooking brisket, has almost entirely erased barbecue's black roots.
There's a whole lot more to barbecue than cooking brisket. Ribs, tasty chicken are not easy to produce. But my whole thing is if you can't beat them, join them. I figured out how to cook brisket.
Now let's meet Johnny Walker, owner and pitmaster of Mama Jean's in Lampasas, Texas. It's a small town, 7,000-ish people, about an hour northwest of Austin.
There's not a lot of people that look like me in Austin anymore. I can't make a living in Austin. I'm the incredible, invisible man in Austin.
So Walker moved out to the hill country and opened up Mama Jean's, where he puts out the kind of barbecue he grew up eating in South Dallas. Recipes and rubs passed down through generations of great cooks in his family. The basics, he calls them: beef, not to be confused with brisket; chicken; hot links, mainly pork ribs.
Joining us now are producers of Racist Sandwich, Juan Diego Ramirez and Stephanie Kuo. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for being here today. I do want to say I marathoned several episodes of the first season of the podcast with the original hosts, and I am incapable of marathoning anything, regardless of content. Whether it's a Netflix show or a podcast, I just always have to take some bit of a breather. But with this podcast, the content was just so incredible and so informative and so well done and really eye-opening. And I have to say that having this show on now for several episodes, it really helped me kind of understand where I think I want to take this show, because you guys are you really do your research, you really do your homework, and it's just super informative, super fun. Now, before I ask you a bunch of questions about the show, I actually kind of want to connect it to the clip that we just heard, which was the Erasing Barbecue episode. You guys were mentioning in the very beginning of the episode about Beto O'Rourke.
Right.
Right. And it was so interesting to me because, now he's disappeared from the political landscape, really kind of like the conversation about, 2020. And I was just thinking, and this is very much like a hypothetical sort of like, a question that I was thinking about, but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. Let's say, because I felt like he was clearly trying to make Texas a little more blue than it's always sort of historically been. And I was wondering if you think that Texas went blue, whether it was with Beto or anyone else, do you think that would have ushered in a new wave of the types of food synonymous with that state? Or do you feel that Texas would have just sort of stayed the way it's always been, known for barbecue and known for, other cuisines that always maintained that sort of conservative mentality of what Texas stands for? Do you think that it would have maybe changed the way that food was consumed in that state?
Well, I'm from Texas originally, born and raised. And so I'll say that, I think something
to keep in mind is that Texas politically and Texas culturally are very different things.
Right. Okay.
I think a lot of mainstream Texas culture is some of the stuff that you might have seen in like old movies, right? Like barbecue, cowboys, all that stuff. But a lot of Texas is also dominated by their largest metropolitan areas, Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and I guess Fort Worth and El Paso too. And those are all historically blue cities and metropolitan areas. And so over the past like 10 years, I think Texas has had a real renaissance. And so they're actually quite a player in the food game. They have been for quite some time. I think that barbecue is just kind of the symbol of Texas. But I mean, some of the best chefs are coming out of Houston, for instance. Houston, we did an episode about how Houston is one of the most interesting food cities in the world because the chefs there are really trying new things. I think Dallas was just recently named from Bon Appetit, like the next big restaurant city. I think, is that right? I think Dallas was. And Austin, of course, has just kind of been a huge player since they've become the hippest city in Texas.
Right.
So I think the political side of Texas and the cultural side have always been very separate and very distinct. I think Beto O'Rourke has been trying, I think Beto and a lot of other Texas Democrats have tried a really hard game to kind of transition us over into a blue state. We're not there, and I don't think that we'll be there for a long time, but in 2018, during the midterms, you saw quite a huge turnout and like more blue voters than there's ever been in the history of the state. So we're on that path.
Can you give me a reason as to why you think the tide is slowly turning, even though it might be going at a snail's pace? Why do you think it's finally happening now?
Oh, I mean,
I think I gotta say it's probably because, in general, it's just how we are the whole country is sort of going blue in a sense. So I think it has nothing to do with just Texas, but I think in general in society, we're just leaning that way slowly.
Yeah, I think also immigration in Texas. There's a lot more immigration to Texas from not only Latin America but Asia, Europe even, and so you're seeing a lot of different political opinions with a lot of immigration and migration to Texas. I think also California has been a huge influx of people from California because Texas has kind of branded itself as a huge cultural state. There's also a lot of big companies that have moved out there. Toyota just moved to a Dallas suburb, so you see a lot of Californians there, a lot of tech in Austin. And so a lot of the political opinions that come from like mass migration is starting to happen to Texas. And that's why we're starting to shift. I think it's also a product of the times. A lot of millennials live in Texas now, and a lot of millennials tend to identify as more Democratic. I think, though, that the roots are still really strong in Texas. Like, you've got a bunch of land in between these big metropolitan areas that aren't accounted for when we talk about Texas culturally, and they have a lot of political power, too. But I would say that I was living in Texas. I just recently moved back to New York, but I was living there at a really, clutch political time.
Right.
So I'm really excited to see where it goes from there.
So you've spent time in New York before?
Yeah, so I grew up in Texas, came to New York for grad school, worked out here for a little bit, went back to Texas for about 5 years, and I just moved back last winter. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so let's go to back to the origins of the show. Starting off with the name, Racist Sandwich. That's a grabber. Like, it just, it kind of like, you're sifting through all these podcasts, and that really stops you.
It's a lot of like, what?
Yeah,
Racist
it's like
sandwich?
Yeah,
we get that so much.
It's funny because we've gotten emails where people don't want anything to do with us because of the name.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, and we have to explain to people what we do. So the name was actually given by the last host of the podcast, and it was from a story that happened in Portland, Oregon. There was a principal at a school in Portland, Oregon, who wanted to serve something else rather than just the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at school, because she was talking about the multi-ethnicity of like the students at her school, and yeah, so then she said like, well, we can serve like empanadas or any other anything else aside from just like a peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Right.
And so then like that went somebody caught that on the
like
news.
Local news caught it.
Yeah, and then people started calling the woman, or they started saying that if she's making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich a racist sandwich.
Right.
So then that's where sort of the name came out of.
There's like a screen cap too that circulated for a while of like a plain peanut butter jelly sandwich, and like the title card underneath it is "racist sandwich?" ? And I think that's
kind of how it stuck.
Do you guys even like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches?
Oh, like when I'm sometimes.
I didn't start eating them until I was in my 20s, and I was like, I'm really happy I didn't have them growing up because I'm not a fan of them at all.
I ate them because in public school, you know, they serve them.
Yeah.
So I was introduced to it in public school. So yeah.
So you guys are the producers of the show. Have you been with the show since the beginning, or when did you guys jump on board?
No, neither of us. I jumped on board the second year. So the first year, the second year, and then you.
And I joined in February 20.
So third year.
Yeah, the third year. But what was 2018, 2018?
Yeah, I can't think.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of work.
Yeah, right. I'm the newest member of the team. So we were not founders. We kind of inherited the show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what drew you to take over the show, to help make more episodes of the show?
Oh, well,
that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, Zahir, Jan Mohammed, and Soleil, who were the original co-hosts and the original founders, they were moving on to new parts of their careers. Soleil is now the food critic for the San Francisco Chronicle and really couldn't be affiliated with a show that did this content when she was producing another for another outlet. And then Zahir was really wanting to focus on his writing. And so we had a big meeting and we decided, like, listen, they trusted us with the future of the show. We'd been with it for a while. And they said, whatever you want to do with it, we'll support. If you want to keep going, if you want to find new hosts, if you want to just let it kind of rest where it is, kind of have it end on a high, that's great too. And then we've written about this before and we said, you know, we were considering just kind of walking away from it because we're both really busy now.
Yeah.
But then, you know, this year, a lot of things happened. We were featured on a lot of best of lists, like must listen to podcasts of the year, like the 100 must listen podcasts of the year by New York Magazine. We were nominated for a James Beard Media Award, and we were getting tons of emails and tons of tweets from people asking when we would come back, and it just kind of felt.
Yeah, it just felt natural.
It felt natural.
Come back.
You had that built-in audience who was asking for you guys to make more content.
Yeah.
And I also think there was a lot of like untold stories that we sort of always wanted to, like, you know, tackle.
Sure.
And that was one of the things that I guess propelled us to come back. You know, we had you know, I guess some sort of ideas and you know, just certain conversations that we just wanted to keep on going and keep them going, and we just decided to just do it. Yeah.
So let's get into a little bit of what you guys always get into, which is food and race. So growing up for me, I spent a lot of time in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I used to go to high school there, but I lived in the northern part of Manhattan. So that train ride was, you know, the scenery changes, the types of restaurants you see change, the types of food that you have access to always changes. And that's clearly a subject you guys, you know, have, you know, sort of learned about as you do your podcast, but you're also very diligent in speaking about. Why do you think some neighborhoods have better access or access to better foods in other neighborhoods? What's the one thing that you might sort of connect the dots with through the podcast and your guest? The sort of one thing that connects that reasoning as to why, you know, let's say Northern Manhattan doesn't have or at least when I was there, doesn't have a smoothie shop versus the Upper West Side, which is fruit stands everywhere and smoothie shops and you know, health options.
Yeah.
So,
I used to be a poverty reporter back in the day, which was last year. And really, it's purchasing power and political voice. That's really a huge part of it. You can't lobby for better smoothie shops or salads or better greens if your community doesn't perceive you to have quite the political power that others do. We know that, like, upper class white neighborhoods tend to be very vocal in politics, and those outside of those demographics are usually working multiple jobs and don't have time to go to city council meetings and don't have time to do this, don't have time to vote, they don't have the resources to do all these things, and so that's what happens.
Yeah, and a lot of these neighborhoods are like immigrant neighborhoods. Again, like, you know, they don't have the voice to speak out, and there's one of the things that we talk about too is food deserts. Food deserts happen in a lot of big cities. For example, the podcast started in Portland, Oregon. Outside of Portland, Oregon is a vast farming area. There's a town in one of these farming areas that is mostly farm workers live there, but it's also considered a food desert, although there's farms around the area. So the people that live there don't have access to food, even though they're farming the food.
Right.
And that happens all over the U.S. too. Outside of big metropolitan cities, you'll have like farming areas where people often don't have access to the food they're farming.
Well, I mean, in a lot of respects, that's what people would label the Bronx, food desert, because, and I said this when I was, I did a podcast over the weekend and I was speaking to the host, and I had said, you know, walking around the Bronx, it feels, in a lot of the neighborhoods, it feels like you're walking through a mall, because all you have are fast food options. You don't have really anything that could be remotely considered healthy. And yeah, you know, you make a valid, of course, super correct point. It's just that these neighborhoods aren't political, right? So they don't speak up. They don't put their thoughts into votes. They don't. And I guess for me, growing up in that part of Manhattan, I didn't really think of it that way. I didn't think that I never married food and politics together. I just sort of accepted what it was, right? Whatever is around me is what's around me. And then going downtown and seeing that discrepancy of food, I never really questioned it. And I guess it's also because, in a way, I wasn't political myself, so I didn't. I just sort of accepted what it was, and I didn't really think about it. Do you think most people understand the connection between food and politics, or they, like me growing up, just sort of accept what is around them?
No, I think people just, again, I think they go back to that, and we get emails where they tell us why.
Yeah, why are you making this?
Why are you making this like
why are you making this political? Why is it about race? Why is it about culture? Like, why can't food just be about food? And I should also just really quickly say that, like, a lot of these neighborhoods where food deserts occur, it's not that they aren't political or they don't want to be. I think it's a matter of they're just not enabled to. Like, there just isn't the right channels for them. Some of them, it's language proficiency issues,
I agree. Yes,
all that stuff.
Sure.
And so, but yeah, I think, like, I run in a certain circle where all of my friends understand that food is really political, but we get enough hate mail and enough hate tweets to know that there are people who don't know, or who refuse to see it, or who reject it completely. And so I think, I mean, I don't know how to put that into numbers. I'm not sure like what majority is, but we do hear from a lot of people who don't get it.
One of our favorite comments is like, this podcast makes me feel uncomfortable listening to.
Yeah, yeah, we get that sometimes.
Why do you think that is? I would assume that, you know, again, since I just listened to episode after episode, and there were moments where I was, you know, I was really affected by what I heard. But in no way was I like, don't bring this up or don't talk about this or that subject. Why do you think people have such a visceral reaction to what you guys are doing?
Because everyone eats and everyone thinks that everyone like if everyone does the same thing every day together, we assume that all of our experiences are the same. Like, how can food be so different for someone else? We're just eating it, you know, it's sustenance. I think potentially too that people who feel this way just have never had to think about food outside of it being on their plate every day. I don't know, it's just it's a mixture of privilege and ignorance. There's a lot of that. But I don't know, I think it's just because it's so universal that there's no way that it could be that different.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I was like, can you somehow gauge who are the ones that are sending you these emails, and can you kind of like take from them, like maybe you just, you know, since food is just something that maybe in a way you take for granted, you don't really want to have it be over politicized or
yeah, like
you know, you don't want to think about it too much.
Right. Yeah,
right.
You're killing my vibe. Like,
right.
Don't ruin food for me. Yeah,
right,
it's a lot of that.
Exactly. The podcast does an amazing job of highlighting chefs of color, which of course is for me, it's the biggest sell, because with this show, I wanted to make sure I had a platform for mainly chefs of color. I mean, I'm open to anybody who comes on, of course, but I felt like this is exactly where I want to take this show, this direction. And so when I realized you guys were doing the same, and you had been doing the same, it was like, this is amazing. Why was it important for you guys to do that? Or was it a thing where, because of the subject matter, it only led you to chefs of color?
Well, I think that came about because there's not a lot of voice. There's not a lot of outlets actually for not just chefs, writers, food writers, journalists of color. And so I think just creating an outlet for these folks, for everybody, for us, I guess, because I'm included in that conversation as well, was very important. It's very important because, you know, you have certain magazines, food magazines that cater to certain people, and we didn't see a reflection of us in these outlets. So when, you know, when the original host created the podcast, I guess that was one of the intentions, and that attracted me to the podcast as a newcomer to the team.
Yeah.
So I thought it was very important.
Yeah, I mean, if you're on Food Network, which has gotten substantially better, but if you look at the bylines on Bon Appetit, even Eater, you check out Food Network, I mean, they're all predominantly white and male. And we know as people of color, they screw up a lot of the stories, they screw up a lot of stuff. And so it just felt time that we tried to provide balance, we tried to correct some of that in our podcast, but also, like, we know that there are people of color doing the work out there. They're just not being amplified in any way. They're doing a lot of the cooking. They're doing a lot of the original, like, imagination and ideation, yet they're not the ones on camera. They're not the ones behind the mic. They're not the ones being photographed. And we're in a unique position as people of color who work in food media to highlight those people. And it was a very intentional decision to do so.
Right. That's what I found super interesting about the, going back to the Erasing Barbecue episode. It said in the episode that about 20, 25 years ago, you'd walk into a barbecue restaurant and you would have a black chef and you would see them in the kitchen. Fast forward to now, it's a white chef and he or she is getting the attention, the media attention. And so there is this skewed, view of barbecue and this super diluted version of, let's say barbecue for just, of course, for this example, and the history of the food. And it's also something that I don't even think I thought twice about, honestly, when I was younger. I just accepted, again, like when I was living in northern Manhattan, that this is the food that I have around me, and this is where the food comes from, the people that I see on television. Let's take a quick break and we'll continue our conversation. Guys, grab yourselves a snack. Foodie Down Bronx will be right back.
Social Club has been here for about 9 months now. We do wood-fired pizza in our oven there. Everything we do here is homemade, from the dough to basically every ingredient we use is fresh. Our chef, Tom, is trained in Italy. He's owned a couple other restaurants before, and this is kind of his specialty. We love this neighborhood. I've lived in this neighborhood for 7 years. And the neighborhood is still growing. The residents really want more diversity in the restaurant, so we thought it'd be something that the neighborhood would really like to have. So far the response is great. I mean, everybody loves the food. I think people are really happy to have something different than the other places that have been around here for a while. The focus is the stuff that comes out of the oven behind me. The pizza is the main thing that we do here, and then beyond that, homemade meatballs and spaghetti. It's just kind of comfort food, especially for this time of year. We have pub buffalo wings. They're made with cherry peppers and a vinegar brine. They're really tasty. The oven we got is called a Pavesi spinner. It's made in Italy, and one of the cool features of it is that the deck spins so that it helps cook the pizza evenly. So we always get the consistent pizza we like. So we had locally well-known graffiti artist who goes by Tracy168, so we brought him in to kind of keep the local vibe. And we're here 7 days a week, open for lunch and dinner, and I hope everybody in Kingsbridge, Riverdale area and beyond throughout the Bronx, come check it out.
Welcome back to Foodie Down Bronx. I'm your host, M, the Hungry Dominican. I'm joined on set by Racist Sandwich podcast producers, Juan Ramirez and Stephanie Kuo. Guys, so when right before we went on break, we were talking about the Erasing Barbecue episode. I wanted to ask, and this, well, I always try to like preface it by saying this might be a silly question, but I don't think it's a silly question. Do you find that the stories of chefs of color are more complex than white chefs? Or do you find more in common with them than you don't?
That's a good question. Yeah. I think like across chefs, no matter race, I think there's a common thread of struggle, right? It's really hard to work in the food industry. It's really demanding. It's really difficult. I think though, just generally as people of color, we see a lot of themes when we talk to chefs of color where you end up working in places where it's predominantly white, or you feel like your opinions get shot down more than others. I mean, those are all common threads that we hear across all industries, actually. Yeah. And of course, we identify with them more because we've experienced a lot of those same themes across, in food media and other industries. But I wouldn't say that like they're any more complex than any other story. I think there's a lot of universal themes in all of their stories. I think the difference is that for chefs of color, their stories aren't the ones being heard the most. Right. Like they have struggle, but it's a different kind of struggle, and that struggle constantly gets suppressed because it's a more difficult narrative to swallow, I think, for some people.
Right. That makes sense to me. I always love asking people about the emotional toll that your job takes on you, and for me, it's like I'm very I get affected by so much. I went to a panel a few months ago here in the Bronx for it's a company called Woke Foods, and they were talking about food politics, food injustice. And I told my producer, Sanji, I walked away like almost in tears because you start learning so much about where you live through this lens that you've never really put on before. So do you guys, has there been an episode or a subject matter that after you guys are done recording, you're just like, whoa, I am just exhausted emotionally, or there was so much information that I do have to like take a break now? Yeah,
I think it has happened. We're students as well too of like the knowledge that we receive from like our guests. So there's many instances where I've never heard it from that perspective. And we hear it first before everybody else does. Sure. Right, but those conversations when you're just by yourself editing the material and just like listening to the raw conversation. They get very intense, and for me it was a lot of things that I've haven't experienced as a male, as a straight male. Conversations with LGBTQ plus guests or women guests. For me, that many conversations, many topics. I definitely learn from our conversations on the podcast for sure.
Right. Stephanie, how about for you? Do you have anything that one particular subject or episode?
Yeah, definitely some of our mental health episodes have hit hard. I wasn't the primary producer on that, but we talked about eating disorders, which is really difficult. For me, in my past life, I was a poverty reporter and a homelessness reporter. So I spent a lot of my time in homeless camps and talking to people whose lives feel like there's no end to their misery. Sure. And so it was really hard for me as a reporter. But an episode that I knew that I had to do because of my background working in poverty reporting was an episode with writer Ijeoma Oluo, who wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, great book. She wrote a Medium article years ago that I remembered called Tasting Something Other Than Shame, talking all about the ways that the poor interact with food and how that's so different than how everyone else does. Right. And how politics, society makes the poor feel as if eating is not their right. And so it's a very paternalistic way we treat them. We tell them they can only eat this and only eat that. We police them. And she told a story about how her mother brought home a Boston cream pie, and she had internalized so much of that shame that she got mad at her mother for just wanting to celebrate the day with a pie that was clearly out of their budget. Right, and that for me, just like, man.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's wow, that's interesting. Okay, so let's go to your favorite episodes to work, where an episode didn't knock you out, and you guys were like, this was super great, super informative. I learned something amazing. Yeah. Favorite episodes.
I guess my favorite, like, we could talk about like what we produce, but my favorite episode was when I went out to Puerto Rico to report on the aftermath of the hurricane, of Hurricane Maria, and learning about going out to the coffee farms, learning about how a lot of the coffee farms were devastated and how long they were gonna take to produce the coffee again, how that impacted coffee shops within San Juan and coffee production in general in Puerto Rico. Yeah, it was very interesting. That's something that I learned, and how the folks at the coffee shops, what was the aftermath of Hurricane Maria too. That was very interesting. Like all the stories there. I learned so much of how people have just the will to just keep on going. It was beautiful. I learned a lot from that experience.
That's awesome. I was in Puerto Rico 2 months before the hurricane hit, and then of course all that devastation was just unreal.
Yeah.
Stephanie, how about you? Any favorite episodes where you were just like, this is awesome, great?
It's all really awesome. I'm just going to have to say my Southern barbecue episode, just because it consumed so much of my life to put together. I was driving across Texas and eating so much barbecue.
That was a really great episode. I did like that one.
Yeah, I loved it. Well, for me, it was just like it was really an opportunity for me to really just take a hold of that episode and make it my own, and really passing the mic over to someone else and letting these black pit masters speak their story and speak truth. And I just had a lot of fun with it because I'm from Texas. I'm like such a cliche Texan, wants to talk about Texas all the time. And so I somehow convinced people to let me do it on a podcast episode. So I really enjoyed my time.
That's awesome. I want to go back to mental health in the food industry. Can you guys elaborate on that? Because I think I'm thinking of it from a different perspective, but you had broached the subject, just a few minutes ago. Can you expand on what the correlation is? What's the connection between mental health?
Well, what were you thinking?
So for me, and it kind of goes to how I had asked you guys about the emotional toll this can take on you. And I asked that about chefs as well, because a lot of the chefs that I know, that I'm lucky to know, are up and coming, and they are trying to start businesses, and they are working, 10 days a week, 35 hours a day. And there is this, the more you get to know them, the more you realize that it's taking such a toll on them, whether it's family life or personal time, physical, mental. And so my perspective was from that aspect of the chefs, the line cooks, restaurateurs, and how that business can be, any business is taxing, but that one, because you're in hospitality, is just perpetually going. So that was my angle from.
Well, you're exactly right.
Okay.
Never mind too that restaurants are just poised to fail all the time. They don't do well, and so you kind of have that in the back of your mind while you're pulling in these terrible hours. That's definitely a facet of it. On one of our episodes, it's about how to specifically being a female line cook, or being a woman in the kitchen and having to deal with harassment, sexual assault, being yelled at by your male bosses and a lot of that stuff. And then also there's. I'm not a female cook. I don't work in a kitchen, but I think too, just being around food and what that does to you, and your relationship to eating can kind of change too.
Yeah, I think also because of the way that all these folks work, the amount of work that they do, they find different outlets, and unfortunately, some of them find drug addiction through these outlets to kind of cope with the work that they do. And that also becomes a stigma in the food industry. There's a lot of chefs or a lot of people that work in the food industry that become addicted to, they become alcoholics, addicted to certain drugs, and that also is part of mental health, that awareness that we want to bring up.
Yeah, that was something that I wasn't prepared to deal with when I met a lot of the chefs that I know, and yeah, it was eye-opening to realize that, like you said, a lot of them, they go towards alcohol or drugs to take that sort of edge off. And of course, because it's constantly moving, you end up taking the edge off all the time, and then of course, then you're abusing drugs, and that was that was one of the things that I emotionally was not prepared to really like deal with when I jumped into the food world. Because for me, it's like I started off on Instagram and it was all fun and games and stuff, and then I decided, let me just like really get into this food industry and see and meet people and see what's going on. And thankfully, the people that I know are not, you know, those cases, but you just keep talking to more and more people, and you always sort of find that's, you know, that's definitely there. That's a subset of the whole industry.
It's part of the conversation.
Right, exactly. It's part of the conversation.
I think like foodie culture kind of can be a little bit problematic in that way, where you're just constantly presenting the shiny veneer of food.
Right.
And like there's just so much that goes on behind it, whether it's literally in the kitchen or the type of emotions and the culture and all the history behind what you're eating that just gets lost because you're doing it for the gram or you're doing it for...
I did want to ask you guys about that. It's sort of like it all correlates together. Celebrity chefs, Instagram, this idea that food has to be perfect, I guess, or what are your thoughts on social media and how we do have these celebrity chefs now, and now we have this certain expectation for food because of what social media is dictating? Because I feel like social media can dilute so much of the history of food because we're looking for something specific as opposed to the history of something.
It's a big question.
Yeah, I think food in general or food media has been a pretty popular subject for a very long time. Yes, social media has sort of made it bigger now.
Right.
But there was always certain people that were able to tell a story behind the food. One of them was also a chef who passed away because of mental illness or whatnot. Anthony Bourdain was one of them, who there might be certain opinions that we might not agree on, but we definitely looked up to him as well because he spoke from a different perspective. But yeah, there are certain storytellers that that will give us a better idea, a better angle of where the food is, rather than just here's the new chicken wings with gold on it, or whatever. Yeah.
I think like big food magazines and TV shows were massive gatekeepers into food and media. So on one side, you have a lot of this like problematic food coverage because there's a lack of representation on their staffs. But then on the flip side for social media, which can also be very damaging, I think social media democratized food for a lot of like up and coming cooks that couldn't get through the gates to get into Bon Appetit or into Savoir. And so there's pros and cons to everything. I think our goal is to make sure that we are telling the stories that aren't being told, and that could be the ones that aren't being told on social media or the ones not being told like in traditional media too. So
right. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had like an extra hour with you guys to talk about social media because there's so many things that I want to sort of unpack, and being in that world too, it's I just think that overall it's not the most important stories about food are not being the ones that get the most engagement, let's say.
Yeah.
Or the most, posts or
we have an episode about that with Francis Lamb, who who hosts the Splendid Table. His whole episode was called "Telling the Food Stories That Don't Pay the Bills."
Right.
So he could do the story about like the KFC Double Down, and that would get like 1 billion hits.
Yes.
That would bring in all the money.
Sure.
But he wants to tell the story about the guy who sells tacos in the food cart in Elmhurst or in Jackson Heights.
Yeah, exactly.
But no one wants to hear those stories.
Exactly.
But he's committed to them. So you have to kind of tell the double down stories to do the important ones. Right.
Yeah, for sure. So you guys, I want to point out that you guys are in studio right now with me, but this is like the second time you've only really met.
Yeah.
How does that work if you guys are producing this this podcast?
Our entire team was distributed, actually. You were in Portland, I was in Dallas, Zahir was he in Detroit? Or he was somewhere in Michigan.
He was in Michigan.
And then Soleil at the time was in Mexico.
Yeah. So we're like in, different places.
Yeah, Slack is a wonderful tool.
Slack, yes.
Slack and Google Drives are really great. And I think Soleil and Zahir just put a lot of effort into finding teams that would work well together. Yeah. There was an instant chemistry when I interviewed to be on their team, and it's just worked out really well since
That's awesome.
then. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really great. So I want to ask you, Stephanie, you are an award-winning public radio journalist. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
I love public radio. I love talk radio in general. Podcasts have been like a blessing. I mean, they've been around for what, like 15 years at this point, over 15 years?
Yeah.
What led you down this path? what either was maybe like the first radio show or podcast or anything that really made you want to jump into what you're doing right now?
Well, I started off as a print journalist, and like the long story of how I got into audio was that I went to grad school. They made me do an audio boot camp as part of it, and I was instantly sold. So I like went and changed my major and got my graduate degree in public broadcasting instead. And then I worked in public radio for a while. My transition into podcasting came really because public radio, despite it being a wonderful place, can be really stifling creatively. They don't really think food stories are newsworthy.
Interesting.
I love food, so I want to tell them. And talking about race can be really touchy in that medium. And was feeling really restless about the content I was producing and just needed something else to do. I just couldn't tell stories about poverty forever. I just needed to do something a little bit more uplifting, I guess.
Sure, of course.
And so I was just looking around for a part-time job to do on top of my full-time job, and I found that Racist Sandwich was hiring, and I was already listening to their podcast before. Okay. Soleil was a guest on our public radio talk show, and so it just kind of worked out really well. We were Twitter friends, and I applied, and now I've just been in podcasting since then, and now I actually no longer work in public radio. I work entirely in podcasting for a different company.
That's very, very cool. Yeah. And Juan, how about yourself? Why did you go down this path?
Well, so I actually I was into film, and I just decided to apply to an internship at the Oregon Public Broadcasting, which is a public radio station in Portland, Oregon. I got the internship and then just fell in love right away. I ended up doing this project where I was a DACA recipient, and I went to Mexico for my first time in 20 years, and so I did an audio diary. So I did this project where I went to Mexico. I did it all with my phone. I just recorded everything with my phone, and came back, wrote the script, and from there on, it was just like something that I wanted to do. It was just that project basically launched my career, I guess.
Audio has a way of being really magical.
Yeah, it really does. I'm a huge fan of podcasts, and they've definitely, of course, gotten better throughout the years. But I was there like in the beginning where most podcasts were recorded in somebody's car or something.
They still are. I
think
it's quite beautiful,
a lot of
actually.
them are.
It's such a democratic place.
But yeah, you guys do such a great job. So actually, the new season of the show premiered October 30th. You guys took a little bit of a break, a little bit of a sabbatical.
Very long
sabbatical. Right? Regrouped. Yeah. Did your thing, and you're back now. So there's a new episode up right now.
Yes.
That was released about 2 weeks ago as of this recording.
Yes.
And you guys have a new episode coming out very soon as well. Can you tell me about what the subject matter of the newest episode will be?
It's your episode.
Yeah, so actually, as of this recording, it released yesterday.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so it's up there.
Yes. Yeah. So this conversation is a conversation with an inmate in France. He has this Instagram page. He's a chef. He cooks he's a cook, and he has, I think, like 16,000 followers on his Instagram page. But the reason why I was attracted to this person was because the way that he cooks, the DIY style that he cooks. Basically, to make an oven, he uses two pans to create this create this oven, and also the way in which he gets his ingredients are all basically brought into jail, like not in the more formal way.
Throw them over the fence.
Literally, just some of the ingredients get thrown over the fence, and so it was a very interesting conversation because he's this Moroccan French man who also has was down on his luck, and the way that he uses food as basically as a venue to pass his time, and
like just kind of a way to project what life will be like when he's out. He uses food as an avenue of therapy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That sounds great. That sounds great. I'm looking forward to that one. That's very cool. Thank you guys so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having
us.
Check out Racist Sandwich Podcast on their website, racistsandwich.com. Follow them on Instagram at Race and Food. Well, that's all for the show. Thank you again for tuning in. And thank you to our guests today for joining us. Tune in every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. here on BronxNet, Optimum 67 and Fios 33. Also, tune in on the go at bronxnet.org and find us on YouTube. From BronxNet to the world, this is Foodie Down Bronx. I'm your host, M, the Hungry Dominican. Remember to feed your mind, feed your body, and if you see me coming along, feed me. Adios.